Donc, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Je vais faire ma intervention en anglais, mais à la fin, si vous avez des questions de me poser, vous pouvez bien le faire si vous parlez très, très lentement, s'il vous plaît. So, just to say, what is Privacy International, I think has already been mentioned earlier on, and thanks for noting that we were among the NGOs that intervene in the case that is currently before the Strasbourg court challenging the surveillance law here in France. What I would like to do in the next 15 minutes, if I can, is to give you an overview of intelligence sharing arrangements and what we have done and what we are doing to try to shed a light on this practice. And some of the questions, we don't have all the answers, so some of the questions that we face when dealing with these issues. First of all, I want to say intelligence sharing is, by definition, an issue that has an international dimension. Now, I think it's already been mentioned today how many of modern communications, sort of surveillance techniques, have an international dimension just because of the way modern communications work. But in the case of intelligence sharing, really, the international dimension is actually inherent to this kind of surveillance, because what we are talking about is the sharing of intelligence between intelligence agencies from different countries. So there is always an international aspect to that. And the reason I focus on that is because that creates some difficulties in terms of both of what is the applicable law, but also in terms of challenges when it comes to oversight of these practices. So what is intelligence sharing? I think one needs to kind of focus on the vast array of potential activities, cooperation between intelligence government agencies across borders. Just looking at information sharing, maybe, and that's what some governments, like the UK governments, have been trying to portray their intelligence sharing with other counterparts as something like passing on a particular dossier, particular sort of intelligence information, almost like if it's almost like a paper folder type. But when we look at intelligence sharing, we're really looking at a vast array of different kinds of access to information collected or intercepted by intelligence agencies. These are some slides that kind of come from Edward Snowden that give some examples of the kind of intelligence sharing we are talking about. And in particular, you can see that there are some situations. For example, the government communication headquarters station in the UK, which is staffed by both GCHQ officials, intelligence agencies, analysts, and NSA ones from the US counterpart. So it's quite important to note that intelligence sharing is much broader than simply passing a particular dossier to a foreign intelligence agencies. What are the intelligence sharing arrangements? That is basically, we like to call them arrangements or agreements because it's still unclear what exactly regulates the sharing of intelligence. The most famous one, and you probably have come across already, is the Five Eyes alliance between the US, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. And that is the one that caught the international attention. But there are other intelligence sharing arrangements of which we know very little of. Some of them, we call them, or were called the 9 eyes. So it's the 5 eyes plus a few other European countries. Then it goes up to the 14 eyes and to the 43 eyes. And one can kind of wonder how many there will be. But those are all based, as you see on some of the slides, on the original 5 Eyes Alliance, and it's just a question of different ways to share, different level of access to that information. But beyond those ones, there are others of which we know very little. For example, there is a Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an intelligence arrangements between China, Russia, and some of the Central Asian republic. But we know very little about that. What are our concerns about intelligence sharing? That's the sort of second part of my presentation. Basically, to summarize, there are four issues that we are concerned about. The first one is understanding that intelligence sharing as an equivalent, comparable level of interference with privacy as the one posed by direct state surveillance. Consider these kind of 3 possible scenarios, which are actually, according to what we know, all sort of possible. The first one you see is GCHQ intercepts a text between A and B, both located in London, as it leaves the UK on a transatlantic fiber optic cable. That's not intelligence sharing, that's all, let's say, within the UK, and it's quite clear what is the legal framework that applies there. But what if the NSA taps that transatlantic fiber optic cable and collects that same information, the same text between A and B, but allows GCHQ access to the whole range of materials that pass through that cable? And what if they simply collect that text when it arrives in the US and again gives it back to GCHQ, whether solicited or unsolicited? So the first thing to note for us is really to appreciate the privacy implication of intelligence sharing agreements. The second one is about the law. So I mentioned the lack of information about what kind of laws regulate intelligence sharing. Most of the arrangements are confidential and not subject to public scrutiny. Sometimes the agreements that we have seen mention very clearly that they are not to be construed as a legally binding instruments, and that's a way again to avoid public scrutiny, both at national level and international. And I put up a quote from the UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights of a report of a couple of years ago, where he clearly identified the concerns of the lack of regulation, the absence of law to regulate information sharing between states. The second aspect we are concerned about in terms of intelligence sharing is the risk that it can circumvent existing constraints when it comes to surveillance. And what it is, I think has been mentioned already how in many domestic legislation there are some particular restrictions when it comes to the state ability to conduct surveillance over its own citizens or let's say residents in the country. Those are kind of quite common. You find them in France, you find them in the UK, in the US, etc. But what we have found is that it is possible through an intelligence sharing arrangement to actually circumvent this kind of safeguards. And again, I put up a quote from one of the first reports that the UN had produced after the Snowden revelations, when this issue became quite important at the United Nations, looking at the High Commissioner talking about governments systematically routing data collection and analytical tasks through jurisdiction with weaker safeguards and for privacy. So talking about interlocking legal loopholes. That's definitely a concern for us. The last of the sort of wide-ranging concern we have, it's linked to mass surveillance, and it's the fact that as we know that surveillance capabilities of states are massive, so is the capacity of giving access to this kind of mass flow of data. As I mentioned before, intelligence sharing is not just about handing over discrete information. For us, there is more to that that needs to be explored. So, how do we do that? First of all, if we accept that intelligence sharing is a form of interference with privacy, we can also accept that it's not per se unlawful. And that's quite an important point for us. Sometimes we are portrayed as sort of we are against surveillance at every cost. What we are concerned here is about the non-transparent, unfettered and unaccountable intelligence sharing that is taking place. It's not that we are saying that under certain conditions, intelligence sharing cannot comply with the human rights standards protecting the right to privacy. In fact, we are trying to work on the three sort of big sort of headers there. One is looking about transparency. The second one is looking at safeguards, and the third one, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time, is talking about oversight, and particularly the challenges that intelligence sharing may pose to oversight bodies. In terms of transparency, I think I already mentioned the fact that the absence of law. What this slide shows is that we started a case in the UK challenging both the bulk surveillance powers and also the intelligence sharing arrangements. And what we won, it was a very partial victory, was we won a note by the intelligence agencies that sort of explain how the intelligence sharing was conducted. And on the basis of that note, only on the basis of that note, the court in the UK agreed that intelligence sharing was actually lawful. The case is now in Strasbourg. I think it was mentioned earlier, so I don't need to go into the details. But in terms of the overall sort of safeguards for intelligence sharing, they are basically, what we are arguing is that they should be the same, or they should be comparable to the ones that we have been discussed this morning. So from the Weber-Saravia, from Zakharov to Szabo, etc. I don't need to go into the details of that because we discussed it this morning, and maybe there will be questions at the end. And the last point I wanted to make is about oversight. And as I said, we think that intelligence sharing arrangements make particular challenges for oversight bodies at national level. What we did is that in September this year, we wrote to over 40 countries, to oversight bodies of over 40 countries, asking 5 questions related to their power and capacity to actually conduct oversight of intelligence sharing arrangements. We received quite a lot of responses. We received 17 responses so far. Some of them confirm our concerns, particularly the fact that intelligence agencies have no obligation to inform Parliament or other oversight bodies about their arrangements, the intelligence sharing arrangements. The fact that the intelligence oversight bodies have no power to review the decision to share intelligence. I put up the one that we sent to the Commission nationale de contrôle technique de renseignement because it's the one that we are still waiting for a response, and it would be great, maybe even in this context, to hear what the reviews are in terms of the challenges to that. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.